Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you how to make these simple live edge floating shelves. Check it out. Okay, so this project actually starts out with a slab that Mac and I milled back in November. This is from a beech tree that we got from a local estate. It had fallen in a storm, and we saw the groundskeeper cutting it up and asked him if we could take it. So we cut it up with the Husqvarna, and it's been sitting outside ever since. The slab's pretty dry, so I decided to use it on this project, and it'll be nice to make something from wood that was pretty much harvested, milled, and now finished all in-house. So I'm just cross-cutting it with the 10-inch worm drive saw. This is a Saw Squatch. It's from Skill, and it's pretty good at handling the large cross-cuts and rips on material like this. It's about 2 3/4 thick, and it's going to be planed down and cut, and it'll wind up being about 2.5 to 2 3/8 inches thick finished once everything's done. So I cross-cut it at 36 inches and then ripped it roughly in half. Before we bring it over to the table saw and dimension it, we're going to take it over to the planer and bring down those sawmilling marks and make them nice and smooth. This is a 15-inch 220 volt planer, and this does a great job of hogging down material, and the dust collection actually works really great on it, which is nice. So I'm going to run these through, just taking light passes and eventually bringing them down to a thickness of, like I said, about 2.5. I always make sure that that last pass is done on both of the boards so that I know that they're both the same thickness. Now with them both planed down, I want to debark them. So I'm using just a little carpenter's hatchet here, and this does a really great job at chipping bark off, especially this stuff, which basically peeled off in almost one piece, which is really nice. And then I'll go back and I'll sand that sort of spongy live edge later on. I had decided on a finished width for the shelves, but since I had the live edge, I sort of freewheeled it, so I decided to rip off of the ripped section that I had done with the skill saw. It was pretty much straight enough that I could do it against the fence, and I wound up making the shelves around 5 inches to 5.5 inches, with the live edge obviously creating some variation. But what's nice is I'm left with these nice square 36-inch long blocks, and I could turn them for handles or something like that, so these will definitely come into use later. And I made sure to rip off any of the major cracks too. And now I'll just cross-cut them on the miter saw. I'm cutting off the ends to get nice square cuts, and then I'm cutting each piece at about 18 inches. They're going to be a little shorter than 18 because the starting piece was 36, but let's call them like 17.5, and I made sure that all three pieces were the same size. What was nice about doing it like this was I was left with one extra piece, which I was able to do some finish testing on and sort of have for maybe using on a project later. Sanding on these, I started with 120 grit and just sort of worked away all the heavy marks, anything that sort of seemed like an imperfection, went through them all. Took a good amount of time to get any of the residual saw marks and clean up the live edge, but they turned out pretty nice even with just a 150 grit finish. Now at this point I'm going to work on the brackets. Now I'm going to be doing a steel bracket for these, and the way that I like to do floating shelf brackets is with this sort of wooden template guide. So what I did there was I took a piece of 2x4 and I ripped it to the same thickness as the shelf. I then marked the center and marked 2 spots where I'm going to want my steel rods to go. I'm over on the drill press now with a 7/8 spade bit. I should have used a Forstner, but for some reason I couldn't find my 7/8 Forstner this day. I then take it over to the table saw and I rip off a good amount of that guide block, leaving just a little bit exposed, and you'll see how this comes into play. This is 3/4 inch steel rod, and it's going to be cut into 3-inch pieces. These will actually be cut down again, and they're just going to be deburred over here on the sander. Now you're going to see where that block comes into play in just a second. The block winds up being my template for all of the floating shelf brackets. And the reason that I cut that piece off was so that I could get to the rod and get a tack on there. Now, I know a lot of people have sort of things to say about using wooden jigs and wooden blocks with welding. I do it all the time, and as long as you're not totally crazy, you don't normally light them on fire. And even if you do, always keep a spray bottle nearby your welding table anyway to put out any sort of small fire. So you can see how that exposed section of the pipe allows me to tack weld it. And what this is going to do is it's going to give me 3 brackets that have the exact same layout. And since those holes were drilled on the drill press, it's going to make sure that those pipes are sticking square out of the material, so I don't have to worry about any sort of special clamping or worry about them being cocked or crazy, even if the way that they're cut isn't perfectly square. So I put the jig on and flip it over as I weld it, and then I go back and put a nice bead around each of the pipes and make sure that there's a good grab onto those metal bars. So the backing material is 3/4 inch by 1/8 inch mild steel, and like I said, it's a 3/4 inch tube. It actually winds up being about 7/8 on the finished outer diameter. It's 3/4 inch on the inside. So again, just some full beads in there, and these don't have to be nice welds because they're going to be hidden anyway, so I didn't even bother regrinding these. Now is how to drill the holes back in the shelves, and the jig is going to come into play again. So here I'm just clamping between 2 flat pieces of wood to keep the live edge from affecting the way that it sits, and now I'm going to take that same jig that I used on the metal and I'm going to screw it to the back of the shelf. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me a registration hole for my spade bit to drill down into the live edge shelf. Now, you can use this jig over and over again and making shelves, forever. I didn't have the jig I used on the last shelves I made, so I just made a new one. It only took a couple of minutes, and now it's completely repeatable. So I'll use this, and I'll drill holes in all 3 of the shelves, and what I'm also being careful about is the depth. I'm making sure that I go deep enough to get as much of those steel bars in there as I can, but also not so deep that I pop through the front of the shelf. With a spade bit, you have to be careful because the piloting point on them can be considerably longer than the actual cutting depth, and you can wind up poking through with that. And you can see how my little clamp system works with making sure that the shelf is sitting nice and parallel to the ground. And again, I'm just screwing that guide bar in there and then running my spade bit in it. Once the hole is started, you can remove the guide bar and continue to drill down because the hole has been started and a spade bit's going to follow that initial hole pretty well. And I'm not going too crazy about the depth here because I know that I can just cut those steel bars down if I have to. So the next step is going to be to router this into the back of the shelf. And here again, we're going to use a really simple jig. I decided to cut the sides of the steel bracket down just a little bit and then trace them onto a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. I made sure it's a little oversized, and I went over to the bandsaw and cut out the rectangle that would be a rough tracing of the steel that I'm using. So I made sure to cut on the outside of my pencil line. And this also doesn't have to be perfect because it's all going to be hidden behind the shelf. Now that that's cut out, I'm going to take it back over to the shelf, and I'm going to just trace out where I am and sort of line it up so that it's centered on the back of the shelf. Countersink some screws and screw it right in. That little dangly part, I just decided to take a little piece of MDF and some super glue and put it on there just to keep it from moving around. This is as easy as it could possibly be. The router jig completely takes the guesswork out of this operation. You're basically just going to rely on it to get you that perfect width and perfect length overall, and the depth you can kind of sneak up on. So the way I did it was I did this first pass and it actually wasn't deep enough, so I had to go back and do a second pass, but this is completely repeatable. I made my jig a little bit narrower than the shelf so I could make sure it was placed properly, but you could make the jig the whole width. Again, I don't want the bracket to stick out on the side, so I'm cutting each of the brackets down to fit within there and just making sure that I clear out any of the sawdust that might be in those holes. And you can see you can check the depths of the holes that you drilled using just a little square and then mark them back on the steel and cut those tubes accordingly. I started out with 3 inches and I went up with probably like 2.5 on most of them, but that's fine. The shelves are really shallow, so they're not going to get a ton of leverage on them, and I think that the steel is going to be way overbuilt as opposed to underbuilt for this application. So I'm going back and doing the same thing, routering, and then cutting the pipes to the proper length on all 3 of the shelves. And you can see how nice those pieces of steel sit in there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a coving bit to actually give me room for those welds that I put in to go. So instead of grinding those welds back, I'm just going to router out those holes and make them a little bit coved on the outside so that the welds can sit in there. Again, you're not going to see this ever, so it's going to give me ample room for the shelves to sit nice and tight against the wall and not have the steel be in the way at all. It's much easier to router the wood than it is to try and grind out those welds, and if you're not a great welder, you might sacrifice some of your strength. This turned out easy and it worked out really good, and you can see all 3 of the brackets are nicely inset in the back of the shelves. Now in between, I sanded these up to 220 grit, and for the finish, I'm going to use a clear shellac. I like shellac because it dries fast and leaves a nice clear look. I go and I apply the first coat pretty liberally, make sure I get it in the end grain, and I do wind up coating the back just in case. Not too crazy about getting fingerprints or stuff on these because I am going to go back and do a second coat. I put them up on some little scrap wood bars just so that they're not sitting on the table, which always makes things easier. And then I just continue with the second coat once the first coat's dried up. And what I'll do is I'll actually go back with some 300 grit sandpaper and sand this back once it's completely dry. But while it's drying, I have an opportunity to work on the steel brackets. For the steel brackets, I decided to use them all to reference each other and then drill 3 holes, 1 in the center of each and then 2 on the sides. I'm just popping a little hole. It's about 3/16. That'll give me ample room for a screw and some movability to level them. And then I go back with a larger drill bit and I just countersink the holes a little bit. Since I left plenty of room in the recess on the back of the shelves, I don't have to worry about the heads of the screws, but it doesn't hurt to give a little countersink and just make sure that you're not going to have any problems. Now that that's done and the shellac is dry, I'm using some Renaissance wax here, which is a crystalline wax that hardens up and buffs really nicely. So I had, again, sanded back the shellac finish with some 300 grit sandpaper, and then I apply 2 coats of the Renaissance wax, and it gives me a really nice watertight finish that water will beat up on, and these are actually going in a bathroom, so that's going to be important. You can see how nice these look on the bench, and after this, it's time to start the installation. So some tricks about installing into drywall. I know that this wall is triple drywall because I drywalled it. And in an instance like this, I actually like to use long screws as probing screws and as locating screws. So with a really long screw, like a 3-inch screw, you can find any wood that might be in there and get a good hold. But if you don't find any wood, you can use those screws to locate your anchors. So one of those screws hit a stud, but the other 2 didn't. And I'm going to be using a lead screw-in drywall anchor here rated for 50 pounds. And those are going to make sure that this shelf is nice and sturdy. Since they're so short, I don't have to worry about them holding a tremendous amount of weight or leverage, but it's definitely important to make sure they're nice and level and that they are strong in the wall. You don't want them wobbling, that's the worst. And once the first one's done, I can use that as a reference and just keep moving up the wall. All these shelves wind up needing anchors, but all in all, the installation is pretty straightforward. There's so many products to anchor into drywall, you can always find something that's going to be strong enough. With the third shelf installed, these are just banged on. I didn't use any safety screws, but they turned out really nice, and I think that they're going to work really well in this bathroom. I'm really happy with the way these came out. All right, that about does it for this project. I really enjoyed taking something that I got as a salvage log, milled myself, and turned it into these functional shelves. They came out really nice, and I really enjoyed the whole thing. If you'd like to see me do this again, but without welding, let me know down below. I have another way of making the brackets that doesn't involve welding. It's all wood, and they work out just as well. And if you'd like to see it, please let me know. I'd love to make a video on it. If you want to see behind the scenes stuff, I showed a lot of the process of making these on my Instagram. Follow it below at MakeEverythingShop. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and hope to see you on the next one. All right, thanks.